This video will walk you through how to stitch the Arguing Fruits kit from the Fabled Thread. We'll show you how we'll use the 3 stitches to create the overall design. So to start, we're just going to split the thread. This whole design will be stitched using 4 strands of thread. So you can see here I'm separating out 1 strand at a time. There is a separate video showing you how to split down the thread, tie a knot. And so if you want to see that process in more detail or just in a video on its own, do check that out. But you can see exactly what I'm doing here. I'm pulling out 4 individual strands, and then I'm going to use those 4 strands and thread those through the needle and tie a knot. Wind the remaining 2 strands back onto the bobbin, as you'll be able to then use those for your next lot of stitching, along with another 2 strands from a separate piece of thread. So you don't need to then throw away the excess 2 strands. So now I'm all prepared with my thread. To start stitching this design, I'm going to begin with the border. And on all my designs, I generally advise you start on the border, as it's quite a nice long area to get your kind of eye in and start stitching, using something that repeats. So we're going to start by filling in each of these shapes with our satin stitch. And you can see I'm working left to right across these shapes rather than working vertically. I'd always recommend stitching a shape in the narrowest direction, as it gives you a larger number of stitches to be able to achieve the shape. So across all these shapes, I'll always stitch along the narrow direction. Now you can see here quite clearly how I'm stitching it, and I'm going to go along the top, and then the final little throngs are in quite short little stitches. Don't worry too much about how neat these shapes look. Your first one will look messy, as does mine, but the moment you get many of them all en masse, it starts looking much neater. So as you do this border, you're going to end up skipping between areas. I would tend to recommend finishing the thread between each of these individual elements before you move to the next area. As you can see I'm doing here, just finishing the thread, cutting it off, and then I'm going to start stitching from the new area. Whilst you could drag the thread, you'll end up having a lot of thread running across the back, and so it's really much easier just to finish it and restart it. Again, you see I'm going to finish off here. And I'm just wrapping it around a couple of times just to secure it. You don't need to tie a knot, just securing it under the back. And so I've repeated this process, just stitching each individual shape using the different colours of thread. Now the stitching plan does recommend kind of the colour order to put in, and so to achieve the exact same design as me. But you don't have to do it in that order at all. Just use the colours you've been given and stitch in any order you'd like. All you're really aiming for is a little bit of irregularity. Remember, the irregularity and all the imperfections in the sewing are actually what create the charm in the piece. They're what create that sense of naivety. So you can see more closely here how I'm doing the stitching. And as you stitch it, just always put your needle slightly beyond the printed lines, because the last thing you want to see when you finish your piece is the printing marks. You want someone to be able to think that you designed this yourself. You don't want someone to look at it and think that was a kit you did. It should look like a kind of unique piece of art of your own. So we'll continue the border in that same way, but firstly now we're just going to add in our rows of chain stitch. So I'm doing the chain stitch here using a link method. There is a separate video showing you how to do the link method, so do watch that. You'll find it in the how-to section of the website. But you can also see what I'm doing here. I'm basically creating a little chain underneath each previous stitch. I'm going to try keep the length of each stitch the same, as this just makes it all look neater. So you can see how I'm doing it here in this close-up. I'd then repeat the process with the colour along the top line. And as I said, do use the colours in whatever way you see fit. I always love it when I see pieces at the end where someone's used a slightly different colourway than I have. The colour palette goes regardless of what situation you use the colours in. So you'd continue in that manner until you've completed all the border. And don't feel like you have to complete the border before you move on to the central elements of the design. I always dart around all over the design just to make the stitching process as interesting as possible. But now we're going to go on and start stitching some of the central part of this design. And so most of the design uses satin stitch. You'll see it all marked here where I'm showing you. This is all done in satin stitch. So I'll show you how I'm doing the satin stitch on this central flower here, but know that you can effectively use it in the same way throughout all the flowers. So I'll just show you it in one setting. So here you see again, as I said before, I always work the satin stitch in the narrowest direction on the shapes. So here I'm working it from the left to the right rather than over the vertical distance. And again, that's just because it helps you achieve the best rounding of the shape. You can see this more closely here. Don't worry too much about little gaps or how neat it's looking at this point, because it tends to be that you have to fill in all the satin stitch before you start seeing your shape look smart. And now you can see I've started adding in the second colour, the orange. And really don't worry too much about stitching directions or overthinking which way you're going to stitch this. I'm sort of filling it in like this, but then along the top I'm continuing, and you'll see I've got some slightly odd point in the middle where they blend. It really doesn't matter how you stitch it, because the moment you step away from it, you won't be able to tell. And every single way that I see pieces stitched always look wonderful and have their own charm. So if you don't stitch in the same direction to me, do not worry. There is no right way or wrong way of doing this. Just to note, you'll see here I've got the hoop being held in a frame. I never stitch like this usually, and you absolutely don't need to. I purely have it held in a frame here, just so the hoop stays still whilst I'm trying to record the video. So you can see a bit more close-up detail of how I'm doing the satin stitch here, working around the shape, and again going slightly beyond the marked lines, so at the end of it you won't be able to see any of the lines. You're really just going to use this whole stitching style throughout your piece. Overall, this design is really very simple. It's just a lot of satin stitch and then a few lines of chain stitch. So once you get into it, hopefully you can sort of switch away from the instructions and just enjoy the process. So here we're just now going to go on to doing the chain stitch. and I'm just flagging here some of the little areas that use the chain stitch. But I'm going to show you it on this central stem. Again, we're using the link method for our chain. The way I'm doing it is I'm working the whole way down the stem first, and then what I'll do is I'll come back in and add the little side offshoots after. So you can see I'm starting each of the little curves from the outer point, and then I'm working in towards the centre. Now just keep your chains quite close together. If the chain's too far apart, you'll find it harder to achieve the rounded shape. So all my chains are quite small here, but that's quite nice because it makes it all look very full. And once you've got those bits of satin stitch, the only other bit to really be aware of is these little lines of running stitch just round the lime green leaves at the bottom. And those little stitches are just useful for highlighting where the lime green ends, as from a distance the lime green can be a little hard to tell. But outside of that, that's all your piece. And so I hope you enjoy stitching it.